Welcome to the Hour of Empowerment. Today we are in season 4 and we're going to talk about strategic thinking to lead change. And we are in episode 4 interview. We have a great interviewee inside our studio. Dr. Charles Bowen Jr., aka Dr. Chuck, has over 28 years of progressively responsible technical and management experience in private industry and the military. He is an experienced strategic planner, business analyst, systems engineer, and enterprise architect. His professional clients have included the United States Army, U.S. Air Force, and the USMC. He has also led projects at the Veteran Administration, Department of State, Department of Energy, Department of Labor, and Department of Agriculture. His commercial clients include CACI International, Leidos International, Abacus Technology Inc., and SRA International. He has worked internationally in Germany, the Philippines, and Japan. He holds a Doctor of Strategic Leadership from Regent University with a focus on strategic foresight. He holds a Master's of Science in Management from Troy State University and Bachelor's of Science in Industrial Technology from Truman State University. He enjoys singing and has been married to his bride for 31 years. He resides in Northern Virginia. Thank you very much for coming, Chuck.
AZ, it's good to be here.
It's an honor to have you here. I know you personally. You have done in the area of strategic thinking and change management, and I know that you're the right person. I have worked with you, your professionalism, and you're a thinker. So I'm glad that you're here.
It's my pleasure to be here, to have a chance to see your audience and be with them in this hour. I think that strategic thinking is the foundation for planning. It's the foundation for change. Strategic thinking allows us to look beyond the immediate item or problem, issue that we're dealing with, and to think in broader terms and to think more globally. So strategic thinking is critical for us. It's a skill that almost anyone can learn, how to think strategically. But it's not necessarily a natural thinking style. Most of us focus on the problem. And it's the old adage of, you miss the forest for the tree.
So what is the place of strategic thinking in leadership?
Strategic thinking gives us the foundation for leadership as far as looking at the context of things. When we look at an organization, when we look at an institution, when we look at the culture in our families, there's a context that we live in. We live in a particular geolocation. We have a particular people, social structure, cultural structure that we live in and are part of. We have a political structure that is all around us. It is what gives us order and structure for our public life. So as we look at the strategic context of things, we see that we have to look at the people, the politics, we look at the technology, we look at the environment, and we have to think about what are these contexts doing to influence the event, to influence the problem, to influence the issue. And when we have a context, we have a better understanding of the problem.
So you mean that leadership is inseparable from strategic thinking?
I think it is. Okay. I think it is one of the foundational skills for leadership.
So what kind of competitive advantage organizations that tap into strategic thinking are going to enjoy?
I think probably one of the first competitive advantage is imagination. You have imagination that you can put to work on the problem. When we think strategically, we think in broader terms. Sometimes you'll hear the term systems thinking. Okay? It's pretty much synonymous with strategic thinking. When we think about water from a rainstorm and how it drains down, If we have a problem with clogged drains, we have to think in context. We may simply say, oh, it's the rainstorm we're having. Well, that rainstorm is a symptom of something larger. It's part of the atmosphere that we're in. You know, the rainstorm may be locally, it may travel across our area and leave the rain as a result, but it's part of something much larger. It's part of a system, a weather system. And so when we think about strategic thinking, we have to think about, well, what type of system are we part of? And what are the things that influence it? If you think of a rainstorm, the heat of the day influences when it's going to rain to some extent. The geography of the area, are there mountains, is it a plain, is it a desert? All these things influence the storm and the forecast. So when we think of strategic thinking and we think in the context of whatever problem or issue that has presented itself today, we have to think, well, what is the context of this? And of course, if you're getting ready to crash into a car, you hit the brakes. You don't think it's strategic thinking there. It's reactive. You have to react to the situation. But for the broader things in life, when we think of strategic thinking, we have to think, well, what's the context of it? And imagination helps us to understand the context. We can see in our mind what we may not see right before us as a problem.
I like how you tied up imagination and strategic thinking, because as leaders, if we are just focused on what's going on right now without contextualizing it, without tapping into our imagination, we don't benefit from the situation we are in. We can't go and forecast into the future. Yeah, and I like what Albert Einstein said. Imagination is more important than knowledge. So,
indeed. With imagination, we can visualize the problem, we can visualize the system, we can visualize the context. Irene Sanders talks about strategic thinking having two components. It's insight into what we are now and the condition of our organization, and foresight, or projecting into the future what may happen based upon the context and the insight we have learned from our organization.
Exactly. If we have just knowledge, we may have insight about today and now, but we don't have the foresight into the future if we don't tap into our imagination. What kind of considerations do you advise to organizations so that they may develop built-in thinking ability and competency?
One of the first things that leadership has to do in an organization is they have to build white space for their people to think. If you're always reacting to the situation, you can't become proactive and put in place the systems that you need, put in place the mechanisms that you need to anticipate the future. If we're stuck in our present situation and we can't lift up our head to look, we don't see the rainbow that's there, looking back at our context of a storm. It's the rainbow that develops after the storm. But you can't see the rainbow if you're just looking at the sewer. So we have to go back and think, well, what type of space do we need? If you look at a newspaper, it has columns. And there's a certain amount of distance between the edge of the paper and the column, and there's a certain distance between each column. That's what we call white space. Now, the white space is important for organizations, and it's important for our work. It's the white space which we use to doodle. It's the white space we use to point to a particular thing that we want to remember. So we need that white space in our time. We need that white space in our thinking so that we can have that cognitive ability to look at the problem and put it in context. If I don't have any white space, if I have no margin, I don't have sufficient space to react or think before I react. I just react because that's all I can see. It's one line after another, something always coming in. But if I have the white space, if I can program in the time to look forward and look behind. Where was I at? What were the things we've encountered previously? If we had a problem similar to this, have we had a issue that we can draw from? We can draw the lessons learned from how we handled that issue. Did we handle it well, or if we handled it poorly? Have we had time to institutionalize and learn from those events so that we can be prepared for the next thing that happens?
I like the white space thing because, many times, especially people who try to manage things, they tighten up things and they don't give that white space to their people. I once read about Google. Google, it provides its people a fraction of their time per day to think and innovate. So how can an organization, for example, create that white space? And can you give us an example how an organization can have that white space to its people?
Well, a good thing is looking at your everyday schedule. For many of us, it's packed. We have one meeting that follows on the heels of another meeting. Unless we take control of our schedule and open it up so we have space to work in, we don't have the opportunity to think strategically. So it begins with taking control of your schedule. And this is where leadership has to think about creating the white space. Leadership controls the resources. They control the schedule. They control the risk or influence the risk. Lack of a white space increases risk. And when you're working on a project, one of the goals of leadership is to decrease the risk. So white space gives us a chance to consider the risk and to mitigate that risk, either proactively by building in checkpoints, building in milestones, building in alternate courses of action, or it gives us the white space after an event to recover. When you think about a project schedule, we try to build in slack time. Why do we build in slack time? We build in slack time because we know something will happen that will interrupt the schedule. So if we don't build in the slack time, we don't have an opportunity to recover from a disaster. And that's true in our personal lives, it's true in our professional lives. If we don't take time to make sure things are right at home, to make sure our kids have what they need, that they have our time, if we don't take time to be with our significant other, then we have no margin in our lives. We have no white space. And what does that cause? Chaos. Exactly. Chaos has its roots in filling up the room. Okay? A little thing can have great influence. We look at that historically. Think of 9/11. In this country, 9/11 forced us to have white space. Remember, they shut down the airlines. You couldn't fly anywhere. You couldn't go anywhere that didn't involve either wheeled transportation or trains or walking. Okay? But it was also a white space and a pause in our social system. People went back to church. I can remember going to a Catholic Mass that was held near the organization I worked at the time. The church was filled. It was a noontime Mass, and it was standing room only. Why? Because it stirred up something socially and publicly. And people wanted to go back to something they knew, something that was comforting. So organizations built white space. They built time for people to see grief counselors. They built time for people to take an extra break. And coming out of that, it helped us to recover. So building this white space is part of leadership's responsibility. It's part of being a strategic leader. and helps us in our strategic thinking.
I like this because many times when we are constrained by current problems and challenges, what we try to do is maximize our time and do lots of activities at once, but that creates chaos and creates more problem than solution, or it doesn't allow people to innovate. The question then is how organizations create that environment and also promote and encourage people to do so, to use that white space. What do you think they should do to not only to create that environment, but also to promote and encourage people to use that white space?
One of the things organizations can do is provide space for that. Breakout rooms, conference rooms, where people have tools they can use to be creative, to be innovative. Whiteboards are wonderful. They help us to focus and graphically depict and think. They help us to think graphically because you have an object and you can see it, and you can look at that object. And you can say, well, what context does it have? What are these social influences on it? What are the political? What are the environmental? What are the economic influences? What's technology doing? Is there other things that we can look at contextually to understand this problem? And when we take the problem, we can say, well, if I put this in a box, what are the inputs coming into this thing? What are those things that are going to be transformed by what's happening here? And we can look at the controls. What type of constraints are here? And again, we can relate those inputs and those constraints back to the political, back to the social, back to the economic, back to the environmental and technological concerns. And we can look at what are the mechanisms that are influencing this, be they a physical mechanism, a social mechanism, or a political mechanism. What are those things that are causing this change to occur? So it's important as we look at that, we look at the inputs, we look at the controls, we look at the mechanisms, but we also look at the outputs. What is the result of this event? What is the result of this issue or problem? What is this outcome? Is it leading us to something? Is it breaking other things? Is it a positive outcome? Is it negative? Is it neutral? And how does that in turn feed into other things down the line? When we think of context and we think of these inputs, these constraints, these mechanisms, and these outputs, we have the ability to think strategically because we have something to look at. Inputs, controls, outputs, and mechanisms, ICOMs. A good, simple way to think about things. But we need that structure to think in. We need to think in context. We need to think about those things that help us recognize a problem, understand a problem, and develop solutions.
That's great. Some organizations like Google, they give time for people to think. And also there are other organizations that invite speakers to motivate their people, to stretch them, to think and innovate. And also there are some organizations that have a strategic thinking team. They may call it strategic leadership team, whatever, but they have a group of people thinking strategically for that organization.
Absolutely. A classic example is Royal Dutch Shell. Royal Dutch Shell developed a scenario practice where they would look and scan across what was happening globally. They would look at what are the social impacts, what are the political, what's happening economically, what's happening environmentally, and what's happening technically across operations that affect Royal Dutch Shell. And they anticipated the crisis that occurred in the 70s with the gas problems. They were able to have in place alternate courses of action based upon what was happening. And because they had those in place, they were able to be nimble and react in a productive way to what was happening. And Royal Dutch Shell continues to do that. During the 80s, they divested themselves of their tanker fleet. They said, you know, we're an oil and gas company. We're not a transportation company. We can rent ships and do away with the responsibilities for building them and maintaining them. We can divest ourselves of these things and concentrate on oil exploration, on alternate energy. And then you look at the rise of Russia after communism's fall. They anticipated that. And they were able to look at, well, what will be the effect on our markets if the Russians bring their oil across the Caspian Sea and into Europe? How will that affect our markets? And they put in place ways to react and mitigate the risk. They put in place a scanning system that is always out there looking like a radar. It's always looking at things. And what are those environmental issues that we have to look at? What are those social issues that we have to look at? What are those political issues that are going to influence us? So they're always scanning the environment to see, well, what's out there that's going to affect us?
So if they didn't have, for example, a thinking structure in their organization, they wouldn't have been able to go deep into the future to anticipate, things that may affect their profitability. I know that Toyota, for example, they have a long-term strategic plan, like 100-year strategic plan. So organizations, they should have that structure, the people who think. What kind of people do you think are right for this kind of job, like for strategic thinking?
I think strategic thinkers require a lot of different skills and a lot of broad interests. For example, my wife and I sing together. It has nothing to do professionally with what I do, but it's something I very much enjoy. We like to travel. We've traveled different parts of the world. We've lived in Germany. We've traveled to England, Ireland, and many European countries together. So there's a cultural context. It's a cross-cultural context. So it helps that you have exposure to other ideas, to other concepts. Singing. I love the great music, but I love Broadway too, and I love rock and roll. So it is that diversity of experiences, the diversity of interests that encourage strategic thinking. Because that butterfly that is flapping its wings, causing the windstorm to occur here, it's in Brazil. It's the butterfly effect. It's in that cross-cultural connection. It's that nonlinear thinking that we can find those little nuggets that will tell us what's coming next. Where are we going, or potentially going in the future?
I like this non-linear thinking, because to have that kind of thinking pattern, you need to bring people from diverse background, because if your people are only thinking in one direction, it's not helpful.
Absolutely. Why do we like certain forms of music? We like the melody and we listen for it. But we also like the dissonance. We like the different parts, because the different parts make a whole that is very pleasant to the ear. But if you take out the bass, if you take out the soprano, if you take out the other parts, all you have is melody. And while melody is comforting, it gets boring too. So if you think of great works of music, you have these different parts. You have people singing bass, you have singing tenors, you have the altos, you have the sopranos, and then you have the soloists. All these work together to form a great piece of music. They're all necessary. If everybody just sang the melody all the time, we'd probably turn off the radio much faster. If everybody just sang bass, we would just hear the drone in
Well,
our
you
ear.
You drop.
So it's important to have that diversity of interests, that diversity of input to help us think strategically.
Do you have any company or organization or group of people or community that you admire for their strategic thinking?
I think I admire very much the folks at Microsoft. Microsoft, one of the strengths of Microsoft has been their ability to anticipate, to take ideas, not necessarily their own, but to build them out into a product. Classic example of that is Microsoft Project. There was another company that pretty much had a lot of the project management community's market to create schedules and to do to do project planning with. And Bill Gates was at a software show, and he was curious, and he saw the line of people waiting to see these products. And he looked at the products, and he thought, well, we can do this. And he called back to Seattle. They put together a bunch of slides and other materials. And towards the end of the conference, he announced Microsoft Project. He said it'll be available in 6 months. Well, that impacted the sales of this other software directly, because people thought, oh, Microsoft's going to have their own, well, we can wait for that. Well, it would be another 18 months before a product actually came to market, but it was that idea, the skills and abilities of the people at Microsoft that created the opportunity that Bill Gates made. So when we think about strategic thinking, it's not original ideas necessarily. But strategic thinking may be a new way of looking at an old problem. Or it may be a new development or capability of something that already exists. Yeah. Okay. So strategic thinking helps us take advantage of our strengths, and it helps us take advantage of new ideas. If we're always thinking in the same way, then we all have lockstep. We're walking, hand in hand, step by step off the cliff. So we need strategic thinking to help us back off and look at things in context and say, geez, I know I'm following this line, but I really don't want to walk off the cliff.
Exactly. So let's talk about now about change. Mm-hmm. What kind of roles strategic thinking plays in managing and leading change?
One of the critical roles that strategic thinking has in managing change is helping us to contextualize what needs to change, to identify why it needs to change, and to look at different ways that change can occur. To the person with the hammer, everything's a nail. Mm-hmm. Okay. If you have to drive a nail and you don't have a hammer, what do you use? Well, whatever's there.
Okay. Nail it.
So when we think about change, strategic thinking puts a framework around that change. It allows us to contextualize what needs to change. It helps us anticipate what are the obstacles to that change. What are the limitations that we put around this change? How is it going to affect? What's it going to affect? Is it a particular set of processes? Is it a particular organizational group? Is it a particular skill set of individuals? Is it a facility that we are in? What are going to be the impacts of that change in a broader context? Is it going to affect us politically? Are there political constraints or issues associated with this change? In manufacturing industries, is there an environmental context to this change? Will it allow us to use more recycling materials? Will it introduce something else into the environment we don't want, or we want to mitigate before it impacts the environment. And it helps us to anticipate, how do we let people know this change is coming. No one likes surprises. Organizations don't like surprises. People don't like surprises. So if we think strategically, we can begin to manage that risk and manage that change and manage those communications. With strategic thinking, we can look at the communications and ask ourselves, well, what does this mean to me as an employee, as a manager, as an executive? What will be the impact? What will be the message that I'm sending by doing this? And often, if we don't think about it in that context, then we'll make a mistake. And we will make a change that we thought all our employees would like, but it ends up alienating our employee base because we didn't anticipate and we didn't consider their reactions. So one of the fundamentals we have to look at with change is, why are we changing? What's the compelling reason to change? What will be the outcome of that change? What are the results? How do we communicate the benefits of this result to our constituent community, to our different stakeholders, whether they be employees, suppliers, or vendors, and of course to our consumers? What are we communicating to them about this change? Do we have a mitigation plan in place? Have we really thought through what we're doing to see these consequences, to see these outputs? Or are we just rushing headlong into this? A lot of times that causes chaos because we don't think. So when we consider those factors, then we can say, how do we communicate this change? And how do we create a clear message? How do we develop that compelling vision? How do we allow the stakeholders to have input into what we're doing?
I like that because I think the role of strategic thinking is very critical for change, because as you know, change is a process, and strategic thinking is the one that helps you see throughout the process, anticipate even risks, roadblocks, bring stakeholders together, and also give people a vision, because people are not interested in change because that they are attached with the way they do things, and they don't want to really take risk and jump into change. But if the leadership is thinking, they could be able to show them that, hey, these things gonna change, but these and these things won't change. So if you are thinking strategically, you could be able to see the difference and also show the people that, hey, this we're gonna stick. For example, our mission, our values, they won't change. Our vision, it doesn't change. What changes is the way we do it. As you mentioned, the process, maybe the procedures, maybe our strategies, and so on and so forth. Would you like to speak a little bit more on that one? The importance of showing people that change is not bad all the time. And also change doesn't mean that we change everything. Of course, if we don't think, we may even change things that must not be, that must not change. Things that we have already enjoyed, things that really helped us to succeed.
Yes. And when we think of change, we look at the stakeholders in that change. No employee is isolated from another employee. They have concerns. They have a mortgage to pay. They have children to put it through school. They have needs that must be met. So to get people on board, we have to explain why the change is necessary. But we also need to ask for their feedback as part of the solution set. Often, leadership in organizations do not consider the impact their decisions will have because, frankly, they think, I'm a leader. I don't have to ask your advice or ask for your input. You're supposed to just do what I tell you.
I know what's best for the organization and for you.
Yeah. So when we take that framework, we cut off the initiative of our employees. We stifle their imaginations, and we alienate them from the decision. we create a roadblock, potentially. So as we look at what has to happen, we look at what are the impacts? What are the impacts on my suppliers? Maybe I'm going to consolidate my supplier base. Or I have quality aspects with one supplier that I don't have with the other. What do? Do I just stop ordering from them? Or if it's a quality issue, do I go to that supplier and say, look, the last 6 widgets that you've sent us have had significant problems. And we had to return 3 of them, and we had to repair 3 of them before we could even put them out onto the production line. So you need to look at your quality before you ship something to us. Do we refuse delivery if it doesn't meet our specifications? Do we go to another supplier with a better quality record? Those are things we have to consider from the stakeholder. We look at our vendors, people who provide us with things. Maybe there's an innovation in a new capital machine, programmable lathe, something else that's going to help us, a robotic warehouse. We have to look at those things and ask ourselves, well, how is this going to impact our process? A lot of places are divesting themselves of their facilities, okay? Why? Because they don't have the incentive anymore in the tax laws to write off things, or it takes too long to write off something. So the issue becomes, well, why should I invest in it if I can't write it off? Where I can rent it or lease it, and as soon as the new one comes out, I can get rid of the old one. And yes, I may pay more leasing it, but that lease becomes part of my production cost that I can actually write off, or I can pass on to the consumer. So as we look at those things and we look at change, we have to ask ourselves, what is the stakeholder going to think about this? What is the public going to think about it? Everybody was great on the idea of putting in these wind farms to generate electricity. Well, now there's a lot of concern that migratory birds are flying into these things and being killed by the hundreds. There was recently an article about a solar farm in California where the heat coming off of the solar panels is such that it will kill a bird in flight if it flies over the array. Now, this was all green technology. This was stuff that everybody said, oh, look at all the benefits. It'll take us away from dependence upon fossil fuels and petroleum. Well, it creates its own set of problems. A good example is the light bulb. The old vacuum light bulb that everybody said, oh, it's filling up landfills. Well, yeah. But when that light bulb was broken, it was just a little bit of metals and silica and glass. And they were easily processed by the ground, by nature. Well, you take these halogen lamps, they have mercury in them. Every single one of them has mercury. Mercury is a poison. And we didn't think about that. The Congress certainly didn't think about it when they said, oh, we want to get rid of this old technology light bulb. We want to go to these new energy efficient bulbs. Well, yes, they are energy efficient. However, they are a major source of mercury pollution when they enter into the disposal and into waste areas. So that's a good example of lack of strategic thinking. Another one that's making the rounds now is energy from plant matter, okay? Alcohol-based fuels. Well, the alcohol-based fuel is based off of a process that's highly inefficient. In fact, some studies say that it takes more energy per gallon to create an alcohol-based fuel than what the fuel is actually worth. So what other are the side effects that we didn't think about of that? Well, you have the corn supply drying up. Why? Because we're producing more and more fuels based off of this biomass. Well, how does that affect people? Well, one of the indirect effects is when you have needs to mitigate a famine, you don't have any corn left to do it with. It's gone. You don't have the grains that you used to have to produce and available to meet the need on an urgent basis. So these are some of the things that strategic thinking should help us to identify, so we, one, understand the risk that's there, and two, we can make a decision on how to mitigate it, rather than just reacting to like, oh, you mean that 200 million tons of corn we had is not here anymore? So we can't send anything to Haiti for relief, or we can't send it here to relief here or there. Why? Because it's gone. We didn't think about the consequences. And that's what strategic thinking helps us.
So in the 21st century, I believe that every organization, they believe that they should adapt to change. So the challenge is whether they employ strategic thinking or not. Because sometimes, yes, you can have a very short period of benefit, but the consequence could be more fatal and more deadly than the solution you're trying to solve by making some change. So that we should use strategic thinking to benefit ourselves, sustainable benefit, and also to prevent us from unwanted consequences.
Yes.
When we walk into an organization, can we be able to tell whether this organization is pro-change? That means, can we tell whether an organization is serious about change?
Walking through the door, you really can't tell if they're serious about change or if they're even ready for change. That comes as you are interacting with the various stakeholders in this. As you're interacting with executive leadership, as you're interacting with their middle management, with their line managers and their employees, you can begin to build a consensus of, are they ready to change? Or are parts of the organization ready to change and other parts are not? And that's one of the challenges we face. I was working a project, and this government agency provided information to consumer groups, but they were depending upon an old technology, linotype. And linotype technology, do one line right to left, the next line left to right, right to left, left to right. Well, the senior manager that was in charge of this wouldn't allow change. He said, we've been doing linotype since the 1930s or 20s. And he said, it's not going to change on my watch. Well, that technology has been obsolete for decades. It had been obsolete for decades at that time. But they were so embedded in the concept that we always do it this way that they couldn't even acknowledge that change was needed, that change was necessary. So we have to ask ourselves, when we look at the different roles and we look at the different people there, are they ready to change? Are there unspoken assumptions? Are there sacred things that you can't talk about? One of the key things of strategic thinking is to make assumptions explicit, to force people to put it out there in black and white, and then to challenge those assumptions. Are they still valid? Do people really want to look at a line going left to right, then right to left, then left to right? Or do they just want to read it all the time, right to left? So you look at the absurd as an object lesson in, are we ready to change? Are we a proponent of change, or are we an obstacle to change? And part of the issues that every organization has to deal with is, how do you deal with obstacles to change in a proactive way? Can you deal with it without going to a threat, or without firing somebody or letting somebody go? And that becomes one of the issues that you have to deal with. But the question is, how big is the pain of not changing? What's it cost us not to change? What is the unintended consequences if we do not change? What are the likelihoods of those consequences being true? What will be the impact of that on the stakeholder community? So change becomes an issue of preparedness, but also of perception. How is this change going to be viewed by those in power? Do they look at it as, does leadership look at this as a giving up of their authority, a giving up of their rights, or do they perceive change as a different way to do things? I go from command and control to a more mentor-protege relationship. I go from being the man in charge to being the coach of the team. And it's those types of issues that we have to look at on a personal level and on an organizational level. Are there structures in place that keep us from better utilizing resources? Do I have too many layers of management? The old span of control was 5 to 7 people. Well, there's organizations now where you have literally hundreds of people reporting up through one individual. Are they less efficient? Are they more efficient? It depends upon the nature of the business. It depends upon the nature of what you're doing. The question is, where should the decisions be made? How do I empower employees at the front edge to meet the needs of those people? Hotel industry is a great example. They're empowering the people who take care of the rooms to do more, to fix things, to make sure things occur, and to take responsibility for the needs of the customer. When you do those things and empower people, they buy into the vision because they see that's a direct input that I have into the way things are in my organization.
So an organization can say, hey, I am pro-change. I want to change the leadership and the organization. But we know that some change efforts fail. Mm-hmm. Why do you think some change efforts fail?
Well, I think one of the most significant reasons change efforts fail is a lack of communications. They don't take the time to say why we need this change, to build a consensus for the need of change. They just say, we're changing. If I just come in and say, paint these walls red, depending on my authority, you'll say, okay, let's paint the walls red. Now, I don't like the red walls, but I'll do it because you have the authority. But if you come in and say, you know, these walls are dingy. You know, they haven't been painted in 30 years. What colors would you like to see on the walls? Then I'm going to sign up to your vision of change and say, yeah.
You buy into it.
You buy in.
It's like yours.
Exactly. And that's what we want to do with organizational change. We want people to buy into the change. We want people to understand why it's necessary and what benefit it brings to them. And that's one of the failures of management, is articulate the benefit. What is the benefit if we do this? It may be that as an employee it doesn't benefit you directly, but it benefits our stakeholders and our stockholders. You know, we're going to reduce these overhead costs, and it's going to increase our marketability and our value for these stockholders. Well, if I'm an employee and a stockholder, then that's fine. If I'm just an employee, I may take well, you know what, you're taking away a benefit from me to give it to somebody that I don't care about. And I don't have anything replacing that benefit. And I don't have any incentive to go with this change. So I'm neutral to the change occurring, or I'm hostile to the change occurring. Well, an employee who's neutral to change is not going to necessarily support other change efforts. If they're hostile to change, they may sabotage the effort. They may delete certain files from or records from the databases of the corporation. They may put a bug into some program we're running so that it hiccups. So when we think about change, we have to ask ourselves who's going to be impacted and what that impact is. What's their reaction? If they don't have a feedback mechanism or if they don't have a voice in the change, then I'm alienating them to some degree right from the start. They either don't care about it or they're hostile to it. And what happens? People vote with their feet. They leave. And they leave organizations. They don't leave organizations because it's a bad organization. They leave the organization because it no longer is meeting my needs for recognition, my need for belonging. It doesn't give me a positive feeling to work there. I no longer believe in their mission. I no longer think that what I do is important. So when we make decisions, we have to ask, well, what's the result of this decision? Is it a decision that we have to make? Or is it just something that, well, it's nice for the stockholders? That's a question we should ask more often is, who's going to benefit and what is the negative consequences on my workforce for making this decision?
So naturally, we should not really judge people based on their reaction to change and conclude that these are people who don't want to change. They may want change. They may have even some legitimate reason why they resist change, and this is the responsibility of the leader to understand why people resist change. Once I read that there are 3 kinds of people when it comes to change: endorsers, resistors, and fence sitters. And resistors are the ones vocal about it, and that research suggested that you should go after the resistors because they have very strong reasons why they resist that change. If you convince them, they will be a good addition to the endorsers, and they're gonna promote that change. So leaders should be able, as you said, first to understand what kind of benefits that organization, that team gonna enjoy, who is losing and who is gaining from it, how to convince people who are losing to buy into the change agenda, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. One of the interesting projects I ran, we had the head of the union as one of the members of the project team. It's a process improvement project. And a lot of the process improvements that he saw were really not going to impact his constituency or him in a positive way. Until we got talking about information processing. And this organization was heavily forms-based. They had a form for doing everything. And it was all manually done. And I was leading the data workshop, and I was talking about what could happen in the future. You could automate the process. You could have it so that you only entered the data once, and anytime it was needed, it was available to the system. And that got his attention. We went out to lunch, and he said, right now, my union employees fill out this whole set of forms every single night to catalog what they've done, where they've been. He said, what you're telling me is they would only have to enter this information once. They would have a drop down that would have all the locations they work at. It would have all the types of business we do. I said, yes, we can do that. And he asked me other series of questions. He slept on it. But the next day, he came back and he was a champion. Because he looked at it and he said, if we do this, he said, for every single employee, we save them anywhere from an hour and a half to an hour a day. Because it will take the time it takes to fill out that paperwork from 2 hours a day to maybe half an hour, 45 minutes. Well, you look across every one of them for the entire organization. That's a lot of time saved. He saw the benefit and he became a champion of change. Why? Because he could relate it to what was going on in his life and what was going on with his union constituency. So it was important to change. So what part of the challenges any leader has is, how do I turn somebody into a change champion? How do they catch the vision? How do they buy in? And that buy-in becomes important, because without the buy-in,
you don't have change.
You don't change.
You can't change this. I mean, you can't sustain. So the question is, because you could be able to convince him, he bought into that change, and you could be able to succeed. Now the question is, what kind of skills, competencies leaders should have to initiate, implement, and sustain change?
First thing is, a leader needs to be approachable. They need to get out of their office and they need to walk the line. If you're not visible, you're just up there. Secondly, a leader needs to cultivate the ability to listen and not defend whatever decision has necessarily been made before. If they can listen to the complaints, if they can listen to the complaint, they can listen to the guy's recommendation. If they're willing to be open to receiving input from the guy down on the line, then that person, when he understands he's actually listening to me, he does care about me because he's down here on the line, he's down here talking to us, or she's talking to us, he or she is listening to what we say, and they're coming back down and saying, this is what we're doing. So that feedback mechanism has to be there. But that leader has to be approachable. Can somebody come and talk to you? Or do you always have to have an appointment? Are they in where you are, down on the line, or do you have to go up to their office? Those are the things as a leader that we have to do. Are we available? Are we listening? Are we approachable? We can have an open door policy, but if nobody can approach the door, it's irrelevant.
If you're not approachable.
So when we look at the leadership skills, do I listen well? Do I feel a compelling need that I've got to defend everything I do because I know everything? If I wanted your opinion, I'd give it to you. How many times have you heard that in jest, but at the same time, you realize there are some people like that. When you look at that, you can also assess the ability to change. Is this leader able to change if it's not directed by him, if it's not his or her idea? Are they really going to change? Or is the change all about them? And that's one of the questions you have to ask. And sometimes as a consultant, you just have to say, you know what? I think it's time to walk away. Because you're not ready to change. And while you verbally may say you're ready to change, everything you do says no. Is the environment cooperative? Or is it chaotic? Is it collegial? Or is it one where people are always stabbing each other at the back? So a lot of the environmental indicators that we get tell us things. Not necessarily directly, but it's a feeling. And part of strategic thinking is the ability to synthesize these inputs that you're getting and to put them in context and to draw from them. One of the strengths that a strategic leader has is that ability to synthesize things, the nonlinear ability to think. Maybe that guy out here on the loading dock has the solution that I'm looking for. But if I never go out and meet him, if I'm unwilling to listen, then I'll never know. Years ago, there was a book written about paradigms, and The author talked about paradigm shifters, and he said the first several weeks a person is in an organization, they can see things that are right and wrong about the organization. But after they've been in that organization for a while, they've bought into the paradigms, the dominant paradigms of the organization. And they no longer can see the benefits of change that they could see when they were first there. So an interesting aspect of that thought is that maybe the best people to seek advice from are the newest people in your organization, the ones who've been there only for 3 or 4 weeks, because they've had a chance to interact with the organization, and especially if somebody's a career changer, if they change from one organization to another, they can look and say, well, based upon my experience, we could do this better. Or they may ask the question, well, why do we do this? Is there a compelling reason? Is it just always done this way? So take advantage of the paradigm shifters. When we think about the light bulb, there's a story that GE used to give all the new engineers a problem, and it was designed to frustrate them. And the thing was to take the light bulb, and the guy would say, this is in the days when it was just a clear piece of glass. He said, we'd like to soften this so that it is not harsh to look at. Well, they had a new engineer who came in, and he was a paradigm shifter. He'd been a chemical engineer. And they gave him a problem. And of course, they've been giving this problem to engineers for years, and nobody ever had a solution. So he came back about 2 weeks later, and he said to his boss, he put down the test thing, plugged it in the wall, flipped the light switch. He said, is this what you want? And that was the creation of the soft white bulb. And the guy was like, well, what'd you do? He said, oh, that was easy. He said, I just put in a chemical solution that etched the glass.
Wow.
Well, none of the electrical engineers had ever thought of that because they were electrical engineers.
Yeah, they don't have that background.
That's right. They were they weren't. They were bought into the paradigm. He wasn't. He was a paradigm shifter.
They were attached to it.
He'd been a chemical engineer, and he said, oh, shoot, just etch the glass, no big deal. But nobody thought about that. So sometimes we have to look for those paradigm shifters.
Yeah, exactly.
And we have to look at those new people in the organization. A good example is cell phones. The generation coming up now grew up with cell phones. I've sat in a restaurant and seen these young people do things with their cell phone, and I get irritated that I don't know how to do it. And then I get irritated at the fact that I don't know how to do it, and I'd like to be able to. So sometimes what we have to do is ask, who's better equipped to do this? Do we need the younger person to actually mentor the older person in other skills? But at the same time, establish that mentor-protege relationship so they can speak wisdom into the younger worker.
Exactly.
So it becomes, how do we shift? How do we become that strategic thinker? I think one of the biggest revelations is to just acknowledge, I don't have all the answers. I don't know how to do this. That's why I need to ask for help. And be sincere about asking for help. Because when we're sincere, people can know we're sincere. And they can also tell when we're just putting on a facade. So we have to be sincere when we ask for help.
Yeah.
And we have to be open for the communications back.
Exactly. I enjoyed our discussion, but we should stop it. We have a time limitation, but I really appreciate for you to share your insights, stories, great stories, and I admire you to come here from your busy schedule and share our audience. So on behalf of our audience and Isat, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. It was a great opportunity to be here, and I look forward to an opportunity to come back.
Definitely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dear our viewers, as you can see, we had a very dynamic discussion, and this is my hope that you have learned lots of insights from this discussion. Now we concluded topic 3, strategic thinking to lead change. And I can't believe it that we have now, how many months? Almost closer to 12 months since we began this program. We are trying to conclude it. Until I see you next time, Have a wonderful time. Thank you very much for watching.